So today is a bit chaotic. Last term we spent 3 hours or 3 weeks of lectures on policy instruments. And essentially what I'm going to try and do today is expand on that. So there's going to be a lot of me talking very fast, taking you again through material that we did last term. Expand a little bit on the Coase Theorem, expand a little bit on the Weitzman theorem. But then most of today should be taken up by talking about two particular instruments that are specific to climate policy, that is the EU emission trading system and the Clean Development Mechanism. And in both cases I'm going to move away from the theory and focus very much on the practice. And then I'm going to move back to more theoretical considerations when I'm talking about instruments for directing and accelerating technological change. And then the reading that you had for this week is about detecting fraud. That's the Clean Development Mechanism. So that's the plan for today. This is where we are in the overall sequence. So this is lecture 4 of 11. It's still doing it. But now it's pretty clear that the strikes will go ahead. I'm not going to join in this week. I'm going to start on Thursday actually. But I am going to be on strike for one of the weeks, probably one of the last ones, because I think we should intensify. And that means that the material of adaptation policy will be woven into particularly next week's lecture, and to a lesser extent in the one in 2 weeks. That does imply that for the seminars for the computer lab we will go to the best 7 out of 9 rather than, or maybe I should be generous to you and say it's the best 7 out of 10 and give you an additional opportunity. Doesn't matter to me, right? 7 out of 10 is probably a bit generous offer. Yeah? Okay, let's do that. Okay, so that's the plan. We're not going on strike for nothing. This is the pay development in higher education, right, where we now, if we accept the offer that they made us, we will be 13% nominally more paid than we were 10 years ago, 11 years ago. What you can see is that pay in higher education is lagging behind the average UK pay, right? They increased by 26%, we increased by 13%. But also in real terms we're actually worse off, depending on whether you believe in the retail price index or the consumer price index. And that is not a discussion for today. Retail prices increased by 19% over this period. Wages increased by 13%. Consumer prices increased by 90%. Retail prices increased by 35%. So we're both lagging behind average pay, and we're actually in real terms worse off than we were 10 years ago, right? So it's not that we're making things up, and then there's issues with inequality, casualization, and so on and so forth. You probably met some of our teaching fellows over the years. These guys are on horrendous contracts, right? No job security at all, very low pay. Okay. So last term I talked about direct regulation. I said it's the most common form of regulation, and I think that is because it used to be successful, and it's appropriate if you have a few large sources of pollution, rather than as we have with carbon dioxide, where we have many small sources of pollution. And direct regulation is essentially the government telling you what to do, how to do it, what not to do, how not to do it. And regulators can do this successfully and at a reasonable cost if they can understand the process. And you can understand the process if there's 3 factories emitting the stuff and all do roughly the same thing. Then you can imagine that a civil servant would understand this. But if there's millions of polluters, then you simply can forget it. Even if there is homogeneous technology, there would be very different uses of this technology, right? So direct regulation just doesn't work. And here are the types of direct regulation. I showed you this last term. You can do all sorts of things. You can regulate the inputs into the production and consumption process. You can regulate the technology that is used. You can regulate the output of stuff, or you can go to downright prohibition of materials. Regulating fuel efficiency is, of course, also helps to reduce CO2 emissions, right? So this is definitely an option that is on the table and actually used throughout the world, right? So in Europe, there are regulations on fuel efficiency that if your car simply can't make the required miles or required kilometers per liter of diesel or petrol, you're not allowed to sell that car on the European market. You can sell on the American market, ditto on the Japanese market, and because the 3 major economies in the world impose these standards, everybody follows them, right? Even though Nigeria may not have fuel efficiency standards, the fact that Nigerian cars are the same as our cars, or rather, they're cars that were on the roads here 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they follow the same standards, right? Outright prohibition is something that we're probably going to return to in the last week. That is also used for greenhouse gases. So the Montreal Protocol that bans the use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that make the hole in the ozone layer. Those things you cannot make, you cannot sell, you cannot buy, you cannot use anymore, essentially anywhere on the planet. That protocol has now been extended to some of the substitutes for the CFCs, the HFCs. And the problem with HFCs is not that they make a hole in the ozone layer. That's why we introduced those things in the first place. They don't do that, but they are very powerful greenhouse gases. And under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, those things will be forbidden as well. So certain industrial gases that do cause climate change will be forbidden in the near future, right? So this is not the way you would want to regulate greenhouse gases, but they're definitely the way we are regulating greenhouse gases. Then I argued with Baumol that market-based instruments or incentive-conform instruments are a much better way of dealing with this sort of diffuse pollution or diffuse externalities like greenhouse gases are. Talk about taxes, which is essentially you pay for every unit that you emit. Talk about subsidy, you get a payment for every unit of emissions avoided. And the good thing about these things is that the government doesn't step in and tell people what to do or how to do it, but it does provide an incentive to do the right thing. And then it's up to the private sector to figure out how to do it. Tradeable permits. Essentially, it's an overall cap on emissions. Then you give the polluters each a certain license to emit a certain amount of these things. And then they can either stick to the license amount, but if they think they have too many permits, they can sell them on the market, and if they think they have too few permits, they can buy them. And the good thing here is, again, that you send a signal, but you let the private sector, who presumably knows best about what they're doing, to figure out what to do. So that is just stuff that we dealt with before. The reason issue with how do you start tradable permits? How do you start a market? And there's essentially 4 ways of doing so. The most popular way of beginning tradable permits is through grandparenting. And I'm kicking myself because this is, I think, the 7th time that I look at this slide and think, why haven't I updated it? So what it's called grandfathering here. So what is grandparenting of permits? Essentially, there's 2 key elements. One is that the permits are given to the polluters for free. And second, they are given proportional to emissions in the recent past. And it's used to be called grandfathering because that is what grandfathers do, right? They look at the past and they give away presents. And then people realize that grandmothers are actually not worse at doing this sort of stuff, so it should be called parenting rather than grandfathering, right? The good thing politically about grandparenting is that it's easy. So essentially what you're saying to your industry is you used to emit CO2 emissions and it was unconstrained. Now we're putting a cap on the amount of CO2 you can emit, so that is gonna cost you something, some real money, but we're gonna give you those permits for free. Essentially nothing else has changed, right? We used to be able to emit 130 million tons of CO2 for free per year. Now you have a license that says you are allowed to do so, but you got that license for free. So nothing much has changed. There's just a little bit more bureaucracy going on. So politically this is easy, because essentially it confirms the status quo. There's all sorts of issues there. One of which is, of course, that if you have a fast-growing sector within your economy, because you look at the recent past, those fast growers are punished, whereas the companies that grow slowly are actually relatively better off. So you're rewarding sort of economic laggards. But also if a company has, for whatever reason, cleaned up its emissions before the regulation was introduced, they're essentially going to be punished, right? So this system rewards bad behavior in the past. Perhaps the best example there is aviation. There's now also in the EU tradable permits for airlines, for flights, and the permits are allocated based on the past emissions. Now if you look at emissions per passenger kilometer of British Airways or Lufthansa or Air France, they're actually pretty high, much higher than when you look at EasyJet or Ryanair. Why is that? Well, these companies like British Airways fly older planes, less fuel efficient planes, and they have fewer people on the plane because their occupancy rate is lower, and Ryanair and EasyJet cram more chairs into a plane, right? More seats into a plane. So EasyJet is actually, if you want to fly, EasyJet is much better for the environment than British Airways. It's also much cheaper typically.
How come the planes are newer?
Because they're younger companies. Planes have a lifetime of 40, sometimes 50 years. And a lot of the BA planes are just very, very old. Right? Now, introducing grandparenting permits, therefore favored relatively the incumbent airlines, the airlines that used to be state-owned, the airlines that still have very good contacts with the civil service and the political class. If you look at Ryanair, right, what Nicky does is essentially, O'Leary does is essentially fight with everybody, right, and anybody. So it's no surprise that the political class, the civil servant class, favors the incumbent airlines. So those are issues with grandparenting. Another thing you can do to get those permits initially to the emitters is just to auction them, to sell the permits to the highest bidder. The good thing from the perspective of the revenue from government is that this generates a lot of money. The bad thing from the perspective of industry is that this generates a lot of money for somebody else, right? So this is not easy. A good thing about auctioning is that new entrants to the industry can just buy permits, right? If you're a new company and say emission permits into the year 2020 are allocated on the basis of emissions in 2017, if you were not on the market in 2017, if you're a new company, then you don't get any, right? Whereas you're essentially at the mercy of those who got the permits, and you need to buy from them. So this is also enhances market power. Right? With auctioning, if you're a new company, you can just buy on the market that is free access to all, right? So those issues are not there. Another drawback of grandparenting, definitely in this beginning of the market, is that you want to create a market, you want people to buy and sell these permits. You give them away for free at the start. So what is the price of these things? Nobody knows, right? So there is a good paper by Smolensy and Paul Jusko, somebody whose name I forget, shame on me. They looked at the sulfur permit market in the US, and they found that for the first 2 years or so on that market, people really did not know what the price of permits would be, and there was a lot of confusion, a lot of diffuse prices, and it essentially took the market 2 years to find its feet. And the same would presumably be true here. If you give permits for free, you don't have a price to start. If you auction them, then at the very beginning, from the very start, people know the value of these permits. Talking about the relative merits of these things a little bit more, grandparenting is essentially a capital subsidy, right? You essentially give, as a government, you give away something for free that is valuable. And then it can actually amount to a substantial sum of money, and some of the smaller companies, this is actually their main thing on their balance sheet, the permits that they own. It can distort all sorts of things in the market. What happened after these permits were introduced in Europe was that companies like Shell and British Petroleum went and bought up old refineries in Eastern Europe, not because they wanted to refine things there, but because of grandparenting, these refineries had a lot of CO2 emission permits, and they just bought up these things, never used them, just closed them down, but they did get the emission permits. So it distorts the capital market. Grandparenting is also, or rather Brexit combined with grandparenting, is behind the collapse of British Steel. So British Steel used to get its permits for free, and in recent years that was worth roughly £100 million a year. But now, because of Brexit and sort of the messing about, the Tories, will we be in the EU, yes or no, by next month? The UK was essentially kicked out of the grandparenting scheme, and because of that, British Steel did not get the £100 million a year subsidy that it was used to, and that is what essentially tipped them over into bankruptcy first, and now being sold to this Indian company, name I forget, right? So these are sorry?
Tata Steel, isn't it? Tata Steel. Is that it?
Something like that, yeah. Okay, there's all sorts of issues here going on. What you could also do with your permits, and these have never made it into practice, is, well, actually if you read PGU, and what you want to do if you want to internalize an externality is you want to make the polluter pay, and you want to use the money to give that to the victim of the pollution, right? That is how you restore efficiency. So in this case, what you want to do is give the permits to the people who suffer from the consequences of climate change. And that sounds fair. It is very complicated, so in the next weeks we will be talking about what are actually the implications of climate change and who would be affected disproportionately, and what you'll find out in the coming weeks is that it's very difficult to assess. But let's for the moment assume that the people in Bangladesh are particularly vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise, would be a fair assumption. Then essentially what you would do is you give the permits to the Bangladeshis, and if we want to emit CO2, we essentially have to buy the right to do so from the people in Bangladesh. And that definitely sounds something that sounds at least superficially fair to me. The problem there is that you would immediately generate very large transfers of money from us to them. You may think that's a good idea, but the powers that be would think differently, right? So this is politically a non-starter, even if you could identify who are the victims of climate change. The fact that large amounts of money would change hands would stop this in its tracks. A final alternative, what you can do is to give these emission permits to everybody and distribute them on a per capita basis. There's basis in law for that. International law defines the atmosphere as the common property of humankind. That is, it belongs to all of us. And essentially what you do with your grandparent permits is the government grabs that property right, the right to put stuff into the atmosphere, and then gives it away for free to companies. Like, what? It's ours. It's not the government's, and it's not the government's to give away, right? So there is a legal basis for this. It also sounds fair, right? We're all in this together and everybody gets an equal share. Not necessarily fair. If you compare, say, people in Norway to people in Spain, because the winters are much harsher in Norway, you need a lot of CO2 to get through the winter, and because population density is much lower, you actually need to drive a lot, much more in Norway than perhaps in Spain or Italy. You would actually require higher emissions in Norway just to get by than you would do in Spain. So an equal distribution is essentially punishing the people in Norway not for decisions that they made, but for decisions that their distant ancestors made for choosing to live in Norway, right? So it sounds fair, but it's not necessarily fair. You do this on a global basis, then yes, we're talking about large transfers again, and therefore it is a non-starter politically. Domestically, this almost made it through the California legislature. They almost agree on a law that would essentially give everybody in California permits on an equal per capita basis, and then let whoever wants to emit CO2 buy that from the citizens, and then you immediately have your compensation that we were talking about last week, right? That, yes, greenhouse gas emission reduction costs money, and it does cost more money relative to their income for poorer people. But if you then distribute these things on an equal per capita basis, then the rich would essentially have to buy permits from the poor, and you would immediately compensate. People. So within a jurisdiction, this may work, and it almost works. Now, all of this is the allocation of resources. None of this affects the market, right? By the Coase Theorem. This thing is not connected. That thing is connected. By the Coase Theorem, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, we've seen the Coase Theorem before. These are the marginal costs of emission reduction. So here we have the unregulated situation, right, where there's no additional benefit. Are we emitting more, and there's no cost of reducing emissions? And here, in the green, we have the marginal benefits of emission reduction. So social optimum is here. What you can do is, okay, come on now. This is where you want to be. Either you want to impose a quantity Q star, that's the optimal quantity, or you want to impose a price P star, that's the optimal price. If there is a right to a pristine environment, right? So essentially this is where the property right is allocated. Then if there's somewhere here, then the polluter's willingness to compensate, willingness to pay money to the pollutee, is much greater than the marginal nuisance suffered by the victim of the pollution. So there is a mutually beneficial trade that is possible, and that mutually beneficial trade ends at this particular point, and here the compensation that people are willing to pay is less than the compensation that people are prepared to accept, so there's no mutually beneficial trade possible. And the same happens if there's actually a right to pollute as much as you want. That is your starting point. And actually here what you have is that the victim of the pollution is prepared to pay more for a reduction in pollution than the cause of the pollution, the polluter, is willing to accept as a compensation to reduce that pollution, right? And that trade ends here. And that is just the Coase Theorem. There we have him. Essentially what the Coase Theorem tells you is that regardless of how you allocate your pollution rights, your pollution permits, the market will always find the same equilibrium, right? The market will always find the same market price and the same distribution of who reduces their CO2 and other greenhouse gases, right? And that is an important thing to keep in mind, right? So this is a distributional question, how you start the market. Last term we also talked about cost effectiveness, right? We call the definition of cost effectiveness. We have a target, and we want to meet that target at the lowest possible cost. And if you work through the equations, then what you find is that the first order condition for cost effectiveness is that everybody faces the same costs of emission reduction at the margin, right? And then Beaumont, seen here, showed that a system of taxes provided that everybody pays the same tax, T doesn't have any index to it, automatically gets you to a cost-effective solution. And the same is true for tradable permits, and the same is true for subsidies, where the trick with subsidies is that it's a double negative, right? Instead of paying for emissions, you receive money for foregoing emissions. You receive money for not emitting. So there's a negative for the emission, and the sign of the payment changes, right? So that's a double negative. And for tradable permits, the equivalence with the tax is simple if you consider, well, if I am a buyer of permits, the lower my emissions, the less tax I pay. If I'm a buyer of emissions, the lower my emissions, the fewer permits I need to buy. So that's just equivalent, right? Whereas if you're a seller of emissions, it's again a double negative. The lower your emissions, the more permits you can sell, right? So buy becomes sell, and more becomes less. So it's again a double negative, and that's why permits are equivalent to tradable permits, right?
There's both the M and the N with a subscript on the C. Where it says,
Again.
where it says equals T
Yes.
on the second line. Is that C small
Oh,
m?
this is the marginal costs, C, first partial derivative of C to M, right? So that is what the first subscript denotes, and then the second subscript is that this holds for company N. Right? So I change the notation from the CDM N to C sub M. Right? Just a change in notation to confuse you. Right, so we've done all this last time. So by design, taxes, subsidies, tradable permits are cost effective. Command and control direct regulation simply doesn't do this by design. Last term we also talked about the Weitzman theorem. Good thing about taxes and subsidies is that you know the cost at the margin, right? Because the tax you impose is the marginal cost. The bad thing about taxes and subsidies is that you don't know the environmental effect, unless you happen to know the production function of everybody. You don't. Good thing about tradable permits is that you know the effect on the environment, because that's the cap you impose, right? But you don't know what the price will be, so you don't know the marginal cost. And then last term we talked about the Weitzman theorem. It says here we have got benefit diagram again. The taxes, we want to impose a price P star. The tradable permits, we want to impose a total cap of Q star. Suppose that the government doesn't know what the marginal costs are, and instead of having true marginal cost, the government thinks that the marginal costs are the red line. Then what happens is that with a quantity instrument, with tradable permits, you under-regulate. You think that the marginal costs are higher than they really are, so you allow too many permits on the market. So instead of Q star, we have Q prime. Whereas if you use a price instrument, a tax, you over-regulate. You impose a tax that is too high. P prime is too stringent. Now, you misregulate, you over-regulate, or you under-regulate. The well-below of under-regulation is this thing here, right? It's good for the environment. It's bad for polluters, right? And with the overregulation, it's the exact opposite. It's good for the polluters. No, overregulation. It's good for the environment. It's bad for the polluter. Right? So it's bad for the polluters. It's good for the environment and have a net delta loss. It's good for the polluters, but it's bad for the environment. And the second is worse than the first, so we have a welfare loss here. And of course a redistribution. And if those two lines, the marginal cost and the marginal damages, have the same slope, then the two welfare losses are identical in size. Distributional effects are of course not. But if the marginal damages are steeper than the marginal costs, then making a mistake with taxation, the pink triangle, is more costly than making a mistake with tradable permits. And if the marginal damage curve is less steep than the marginal cost curve, then making a mistake with taxes is less costly than making a mistake with tradable permits. Right? So that's the Weitzman theorem. Here given in words, we looked at this last term. The marginal damage cost curve is less steep than the marginal abatement cost curve, then mistakes with price instruments are less costly than our mistakes with quantity instruments, and vice versa. So that is true in general. Now, what is the case with tradable with climate change? And here we have Weitzman. Well, climate change depends on emissions across the world, emissions from everybody, and it depends on emissions accumulated over decades and centuries. So if the UK uses a system of tradable permits, as the government has said and said not that will do, then if we give out too many permits for, say, the years 2022 to 2025, does that really affect climate change? No, because it's a 3-year period. And the UK is responsible for 1.5% of global emissions. So making a mistake with the total quantity of CO2 permits in one parliament between two elections doesn't really affect the climate, and therefore doesn't really affect the damage done. So this curve is shallow, if not almost flat, right? Does it matter for the costs to the UK economy between 2022 and 2025, whether we want to cut emissions by 1% or 10% or 50%? Absolutely, right? It doesn't matter for climate change, but it greatly matters for the cost. We have a lenient target, then costs are going to be negligible. If we have a stringent target, then we actually run the risk of ruining the economy. So yes, the marginal damage cost curve is flat for a global stock pollutant. The marginal cost curve is not flat. So for a problem like climatic change, taxes are the preferred instrument over tradable permits. This is how you want to regulate CO2, right? Weitzman wrote this up when he was much younger than he looks here in 1974. If you want to play with the curves yourself, there is an interactive app on this particular site. No, as I said, he wrote this up in 1974. This is well accepted, well established economic theory. A number of people are crossed that Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize and did not share it with Weitzman, and that is one of the reasons that he hanged himself. But the political class did not follow this advice, right? So economic theory says use taxes, don't use tradable permits. What their leaders have done is create markets of tradable permit, markets of emission permits galore, right? So they started with the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, which established emissions trade between countries of the OECD. It also established emissions trade between countries of the OECD and what then was called countries in transition, so that's Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And it created a clean development mechanism for trade in emission permits between rich countries and poor countries. So there we have free markets already. Within the EU there is the emissions trading system, or scheme as it used to be called, and then one that is somewhat separate for aviation. I mentioned that before. There's two permit markets in the USA, one in the northeast called RGGI, and one in California. There's 9 emission markets in China, in selected provinces or cities. There's one in New Zealand, there's one in South Korea. Switzerland has a separate one. Kazakhstan has a market as well. Australia may or may not have a market depending on the time of day, and so on and so forth, right? So the first order condition for cost effectiveness is that everybody faces the same price for their emission permits, right? That is the condition. If you create 18 separate markets, and I think there's 18, but I may have miscounted, you have 18 different prices. So you immediately violate your condition for cost effectiveness. It is as if politicians have sort of heard and misunderstood economists, right? Economists tend to say two things. One, more is better. And second, markets are good. And it is as if politicians have sort of confused the two and have thought more markets is better, which is definitely not the case. Now, and the law of one price definitely does not hold. These are the prices of permits, all in US dollars per ton of CO2, so directly comparable. CO2 is the same, dollars are the same for the period of 1st of January 2018 to the 1st of September 2019. And what you see is that, yeah, there is no uniform price, right? So this is the development of the price in the EU. It's gone up steadily. This is the price in South Korea. Was equal for a while. The price in New Zealand. Here we have California. RGGI is the light blue that is here, completely masked by what is going on in China. And here we have all the Chinese markets. And even within China, you have widely different prices, right? And if you're eagle-eyed, you also see within the US, you have very different prices for CO2 emission permits. So the law of one price does not hold. It should hold, right? Go ahead.
Can countries like, or some of them are in different countries, but can they trade with each other? Or is that not how it works? Because it's only been the province that
This is a question for which we don't have a proper answer yet. It's a bit too young. But your question is, can permit markets be coupled to one another? Can you exchange permits? And you can look at this from different directions. The first thing you may consider is that long distance trade is actually much older than the nation state. Right? The nation state was created by the Treaty of Westphalia in, what was it, 1637, if I'm not mistaken. Long distance trade, we know, goes back. Yes, we don't know. It goes back tens of thousands of years, right? So you would say, well, that's the natural state of economic agents, that they trade with each other. However, what we're not talking here about jewelry or oil or a loaf of bread or anything. These permits are not goods. They're not services either. They are government licenses. And the only reason these things exist is because you have a piece of paper or some electronic proof that you are allowed to do this, right? So they're government licenses. So essentially what you need in order to have international trade of these permits, or for that matter, intra-jurisdictional trade within China or within the US, is for the authority in market A to acknowledge and recognize the permits from jurisdiction B, right? That is what you need, and presumably vice versa. So that is what you need. There was before, and I should have said that, before there was the EU ETS, there was an emissions trading system in Denmark and one in the UK, and they had this mutual recognition of their permits. So it's theoretically possible, but it's also possible in practice. Of course, that existed for 12 months or so, and then the EU ETS took over, and it became irrelevant. Now, it's immediately clear that this is not what happened here, right? What is clear is that California does not recognize RGGI. What is clear is that Beijing does not recognize Shanghai in the dark blue. Otherwise, those prices would have converged. And there's all sorts of reasons floating around in the literature why this is. Some people say, well, it's just too complicated because these different systems, they have different leniency in their emission targets. They have different rules about how you measure emissions and how you enforce violations of permits. They have different rules about what is CO2 really, and how do you measure that. And definitely if you go to CO2 that does not come from fossil fuel burning but comes from land use change, or you're talking about not CO2 but methane that comes from cow burps and so on and so forth, the actual definition and the actual measurement of permits becomes tricky. So different countries have different rules on that, and they sort of say, well, it's very difficult in practice to do so. And that is an argument that you read in the literature. I do not believe that for one moment. If you look at trade and international finance, it's also very complicated. And different countries work under very different rules about how to define a company and how to define capital and how to define a loan and how to define an interest rate. And we sort that out, right? And different companies have very different rules about bankruptcy and very different legal systems. And yet we have international finance, right? So I don't believe that there's any practical reason for that. Really what you want here is to say, well, if enforcement of emission permits in China is different than enforcement of emission permits in Europe, and say it's more lenient in China than in Europe, then what you would say is that 1 ton of CO2 from China is not the same as 1 ton of CO2 from Europe. And you would say 1 ton of CO2 from China is worth 2 tons of CO2 from China, right? You discount them by half. if that's the appropriate number. So I think you can do this. Because they're government licenses rather than goods or services, there are actually no international rules about this trade at all. WTO has nothing to say about this. So you can do whatever you want. And there is no reason why you would not impose those regulations. The story that I believe, but others disagree, has to do with the fact that different jurisdictions don't trust each other fully. So if we're talking about California and New England, right here is New England with a few other states, they actually have no basis to talk to each other, right? They're lateral. If you look at Beijing and Shanghai, they also have no basis to negotiate because there's no multilateral negotiations within China, right? It's either province or federal. The people from REGI did talk to the EU about whether they would recognize their permits. And the answer was no, for reasons that I'll come back to after the break, right? So in principle, there's nothing stopping coupling of these markets. In practice, it has happened once, only for a very short period. So let's look for 10 minutes at the EU ETS and have a 10-minute break and then look a little bit more at the EU ETS. And I'm going to give you a lot of institutional detail. And the reason for sort of deviating from the grand theory of things and just focusing on what was really going on is, I think, important because typically in real life details matter more than principles. So what is the EU ETS? It started in 2005. Initially it covered around 40% of all CO2 emissions. By now it covers around 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a little bit of methane and some more of nitrous oxide in the EU ETS, but it's mostly CO2. The trade is midstream. Well, what does that mean? You want to regulate CO2 emissions. How do you do that? Well, there's essentially 3 points at which you can say this is where we fix our CO2. And the first thing is called upstream. And you say, well, CO2 equals the amount of fossil fuels that are dug out of the ground or that are imported into the European Union, right? So you measure it at the point of importation or mining. The problem with that is market power. There's only a few companies that do this sort of stuff, and therefore asking them to measure CO2 and trade in permits would create additional market power, right? You would have a market that is immediately distorted. So that is upstream, and therefore you do not want to do that. The alternative is downstream, and that is that you measure the CO2 and you put the regulation at the point of final use. So if you fill up your car with petrol, or if you heat your house, or if you load your mobile phone, then at that point you pay for the emissions that come from that. Market power is not an issue because in the EU we're talking about 500 million people. The issue there is one of cost, right? You're regulating 500 million people, and practicality. How would you do that? Well, for young people in the UK that is relatively easy, right? What you would need is a carbon account. And there's two options to solve this. Either your banks would immediately offer you an additional function on your bank card and say with an account CO2 for you as well. And then every time you buy electricity or every time you buy petrol, you buy the necessary permits that come with it automatically, just like VAT shows up on your transactions automatically, or you would surrender some of the permits that you have in your account just as your surrender some money to get these goods, right? So that is how it would work. If the banks take this up, alternatively, because most of your permits come from utilities, most of your CO2 comes from your utilities, the utilities would provide this service, like one of the two. Hard to predict which of the two would put it in. The problem there is that there's a whole bunch of people, poorer people, older people, people in Eastern Europe, who don't have bank accounts. About 15-20% of people in the EU don't have these sort of things, and then it becomes essentially impossible to do this, right? So therefore they opted for midstream trade, which is around 10,000 facilities in Europe are regulated. So those are the steel producers, I mentioned British Steel, they are the major utilities, and so on and so forth, including large, and they buried it on the ground so I can't point at it anymore, including large combined heat power plants. And it's essentially not a sectoral issue, well it's partly sectoral. Transport, for instance, is not in, but it's mostly size. So we have a small combined heat and power plant because we are as small as university and it's now buried on the ground there. But Imperial College is larger, has many more students than we have, and has a large hospital, so the emissions of Imperial College are in the EU ETS, but the emissions of University of Sussex are not, right? So it's based on size. Here I did change the word. Permits were initially grandparented, which is a capital subsidy, I talked about this, and we are now towards the end of a gradual transition from grandparenting to complete auctioning of those permits, and that transition took around 8 years. And permits can be banked but not borrowed. So within a compliance period, and the current compliance period runs from 2013 till the 31st of December of this year, permits can be shifted through time without any issue. The reason for that is there's natural variation in the amount of energy you use. Depending on the weather, if it's very cold, we emit a lot of CO2. If it's not, if it's a mild winter, as this year we don't emit so much CO2. Also the driving season in summer responds to the weather and so on and so forth. You have variability in the economy, you go for booms and busts, and therefore it is very hard to predict the exact amount of emissions in any particular year. And therefore you cannot constrain emissions in a particular year, because it may happen that you have a bad year for emissions and on the 23rd of December you have used all your CO2. And then Boris Johnson would have to put his head on telly and say, sorry, emissions are up, we're going to close the country for Christmas and we'll be back on the 1st of January, right? So turn off your ovens, turn off your lights and so on and so forth. That cannot be, right? But if instead you have a permit to emit somewhere between the years 2013 and 2020, that variability sort of smooths out and there's a much lower chance of running out of permits just before Christmas, right? So full flexibility within the compliance period. Between compliance periods, you can bank but not borrow. So emission permits that were issued in the year 2011 are still valid, but emission permits that will be issued in the year 2021 are not valid in the year 2020. right? And that's for practical reasons. We can't travel through time in one direction at a constant speed, right? So there's no way we could enforce this. And then there are, as a further safety mechanism, there are fines for excess emissions. So if you emit too much, it's not that they're going to throw you in jail or shut down your business, you're going to pay a fine. Those are steep fines. The price of permits, now, what did I do? The price of permits has never been higher than 30 euros per ton of CO2. The fine is 1,000 euros, right? So yes, you want to comply. So this is the complete history of prices in the EU ETS, ending at €24.12 this morning, and starting in the year 2005. So emissions were high, or costs, prices were high, collapsed, jumped back up, came down, and now they've risen again. Prices were initially high because the market was very thin. In the very beginning, the market essentially consisted of two German utilities selling a small amount of permits to each other. So company A sold 1,000 permits to company B for a very high price, and then on Tuesday and then on Wednesday, those permits were sold back by company B to company A. So no net loss there. They kept the price high, kept a lot of other companies out of the market, and the reason why they did this was to convince Merkel that emission reduction is really, really expensive and she should not make it more stringent. So that was at the very beginning. Very thin market. Inexperienced traders didn't really knew what was going on, and then the prices collapsed. And the reason for that is back at our neighbor. In the very first phase of the EU ETS, member states of the EU were responsible for allocating permits to their companies. And around 50% of emissions were covered by the EU ETS. The other 50% of emissions were covered by something that was pretty vague. So what is in the best interest of the UK government? Well, if we are generous to our companies and we allocate them more permits than they really need, then essentially we create an export opportunity for our companies. They can sell their permits to German companies, and of course the German government would never do this, right? The German government did exactly the same thing, and the French government did exactly the same thing. So this is the market responding to the discovery of a severe over-allocation of permits. Essentially the price collapsed to zero. Market was reset in 2008, started high. Prices were relatively high, but very gradually it was discovered that the growth projections, the economic growth projections of the EU were just way too optimistic. And then we had the economic crisis and everything, and the prices collapsed, right? So there's again over-allocation. That has been corrected. So a lot of permits have essentially been taken off the market. And there are announcements of very stringent climate policy in the future, right? And that is why permit prices have gone up again. And economic growth has recovered and everything. Up to a point, right? I mean, more recently, you see a slight dip in the prices again. So what happens? All sorts of things that happen in this market. I told you about the initial things that has been remedied, because now it's the European Commission that is in charge of all allocation to all companies. There have been issues with hacking. Free after Lenin, right? Property is theft. As soon as you create a property right, somebody's going to try and steal it. So these emission permits are not pieces of paper that tell you you have the right to, but it's in an electronic registry, and those registries were hacked. They had not foreseen oh, they're going to create something that has a value of billions of euros. Somebody's got to try and steal it. It had not occurred to them that that would happen. Unclear how many permits are stolen. What is clear is that the market has to be suspended for a bit. Another thing that they could have foreseen but did not is carousel fraud. Initially, VAT rules on permits were not harmonized across the EU, and some countries charged VAT and other countries did not. So if you're clever and ruthless, what you do is you buy some permits in a country where there's no VAT on those permits, then you sell them into a country where there is VAT, you collect the VAT on behalf of the taxman, but you only need to pay your VAT every 3 months or so. So with the VAT that you collected, you're going to buy more permits in a country where no VAT is collected, and then sell those permits to a country where there is VAT on the permits, and you do that, keep it up for 3 months or so, you collect a lot of money. There's 20% price difference essentially. You go through that loop a number of times, say once a day for 3 months, and then you need to pay the VAT, but just before you do that you make off to a country, preferably in the Caribbean, where there's no extradition treatment, right? There's another slide that I should have updated. When I first wrote this, they uncovered around 300 million in carousel fraud that now has gone up to 1.5 billion, right? Don't do this, this is illegal. You do it, make sure that you run up on time. Another thing that happened in the EU ETS has to do with, and it's Romania with an O, not Romania with a U. Shame on me. Another thing that happened in the EU ETS has to do with what went on in Romania. CO2 is not monitored. We don't measure CO2 emissions. What we do is we we measure energy use. And if you burn a liter of petrol and you burn it completely, then we know how much CO2 was emitted, because we measure that in the lab, or we figure that out from the chemical properties of the petrol. But we don't monitor the CO2 per se. We impute that from energy use. It's a common mistake that people make, that we measure CO2. It's not that we have a CO2 meter on a smokestack, for instance. We don't do that. We impute these things. And that means that figuring out how much CO2 emissions, how much CO2 is emitted, essentially requires a civil servant to do computations and to compare the reports of companies and so on and so forth. Now, the civil servant in charge of this in Romania got pregnant, went on maternity leave for a year, all good, but wasn't replaced. So for a year, emissions from Romania were not monitored at all. It was just whatever companies reported was true. As a result, Romania was kicked out of the UN for a bit. It's a strict violation of the rules, right? But was allowed to continue within the EU ETS. So we just don't know what happened to those emissions. Companies may have sold all their permits but not reduce their emissions. We just don't know what happened during that particular year. Similar issues, nothing to do with pregnancy, happened in Slovenia and I believe Lithuania, but may have been Latvia. This leads me to the final point, that even though this is a European scheme, the monitoring and enforcement of these permits is done by the member states, or in the case of the UK, the devolved authorities. It's a Scottish thing, not a UK thing. So that is an issue. And combined with that, the liability rules are seller beware. So there's two types of consumer liability, buyer beware and seller beware. And oranges, for instance, are buyer beware. That is to say, if you go to the supermarket, you go to the co-op, and you buy a net of mandarins or oranges, you pay for them, you walk out of the shop, and then you discover that they're all rotten, that is your problem. You should not have paid for them, right? As soon as you pay for them, it is your problem. That is buyer beware, and that is why you should inspect your fruit before you pay for it. Seller beware is, for instance, for second-hand cars. If you buy a second-hand car, you pay for it, it's yours, you fill out all the forms, and then you take it to a different garage, and you let it inspect them, and they discover all sorts of issues, you can bring it back within 4 weeks. If you discover a problem that the seller did not inform you about within 4 weeks. Similarly, if you have a house built, and within 7 years, problems pop up with the foundation of that house, then you can take it back to the builder and have it repaired at their cost, seller view, right? The reasons for this has to do with asymmetric information, statelets, Akerlof, and so on and so forth, right? Now, permits, emission permits, are seller beware. That is to say, if an English company buys a permit from an Italian company, and it turns out that that Italian company did not actually reduce its emissions, it just sold all its permits and continued on emitting, then the English company has to call up the Environment Agency in Cardiff and say, I inadvertently bought a fraudulent permit. And then the Environment Agency say, thank you for reporting this, thank you for your honesty, you're off the hook, you did nothing wrong. And the Environment Agency calls up its Italian counterpart, and the Italian counterpart will say thank you very much and hang up the phone and go back to sleep. Right? The enforcement of these emission reductions is done by the member states, and therefore total enforcement is as weak as the weakest legal system within the EU. And I mentioned Italy because Italy for a very long time had a convicted fraudster as its prime minister, right? Italy defrauded the EU over milk permits and over olive oil subsidies. Spain did the same. Organized crime is part of the government in Cyprus and part of the government in Romania, right? Those are the guys who are enforcing our emissions eventually, right? So that is a big issue, and that is why, going back to your question earlier, the RGGI states, the New England states in the US, they looked at this enforcement regime and said, we're not going to do business with Cyprus. We have stringent environmental legislation. We're not going to let our emission permits be eventually enforced by the Russian mob. So that is why that particular international, cross-Atlantic, transatlantic trade fell through. Come on, works. So there's all sorts of issues with the EU ETS. I also promised to talk a little bit, and actually I did last term, already talked about the Clean Development Mechanism. So the Clean Development Mechanism allows rich countries, European countries, and Japan in particular, to invest in emission reduction in poor countries. Now this is different than tradable permits, because the EU ETS works with this company, company A as a cap, company B as a cap on its emissions, and they can trade their emissions cap. Poor countries do not have emission reduction targets, so there is no cap, and therefore no emission rights. So instead, the trade is in certified emission credits. And those emission credits are essentially, I have a project that I think will reduce emissions to below what they otherwise would have been, and now I want to be paid for the amount of emissions I reduced. So there's a counterfactual here, or actually a double counterfactual. You're comparing emissions as you project them to be with your project to emissions as they would have been without your project. And then you sell the difference, right? Now, you can immediately see all the issues there, and therefore there is a very hefty bureaucracy to make sure that those emission reductions are true emission reductions. That has three implications. The first is that bureaucracy comes at a price. And typically what we see in CERs are actually compatible with EU ETS permits. What we immediately see is that there's typically a price wedge of around €1 per ton of CO2 between the price of the two. So that is one thing. The second thing is that this bureaucracy is a fixed cost. And therefore, clean development mechanism is biased towards bigger projects. And the third thing, and it's actually four things. The third thing is that filling out those forms and getting the permissions, and you actually need permission from 17 committees, filling out all the forms and everything essentially takes an MSc. You need to be pretty clever to do this. And this means smaller projects drop out, but also poorer countries drop out. Because if you take a country like Ghana, there's only so many qualified people you have in the country, and do you want them to be filling out forms for the clean development mechanism? Not really. So very poor countries drop out. And there's a heavy bias towards the larger countries, India, China, where there's a fair number of reasonably educated people, countries like Costa Rica, where there's a reasonably educated workforce, but the poorest countries, they just don't know how to deal with the bureaucracy. They just get lost, they can't make the effort. So it's very skewed. And then it can also go completely wrong. And last term I gave you this example, so this term let me give you a different example. A friend of a friend actually studied with him, and a long time ago now, I was sitting there and somebody was explaining the clean development mechanism to me, which was then called joint implementation still, and Bernd is his name, was also in class. Now Bernd is much smarter than I am, right? Maybe not academically, but he was paying attention during class and I was not. So what happened was that he inherited some money from his grandmother, and he went to Indonesia and he bought a motorcycle factory with that money and closed it down. And having closed down the factory, he had reduced emissions, obviously, because the factory was no longer operating, the machines were no longer working, and so on and so forth. So he had verifiably reduced emissions. He sold the permits, he fired everybody, he sold the machinery and so on and so forth, and then he bought 2 motorcycle factories and closed them down, and repeated this for a while until he had 100 million euros in his bank account, and then he went to the Caribbean, not because of extradition treaties, but because of the weather, and hasn't been seen or heard since. Did he reduce emissions? No. What he did was within the project, within the box of the project, he closed down a factory and within the confines of the project reduced emissions. He did not change the demand for motorcycles. He actually sold all the machinery, fired all the workers. Hopefully they were hired by the factory next door, where they started building motorcycles again and emitting CO2. So he did not reduce emissions, right? In Indonesia, he just reduced emissions within the confines of the project. So CRs are open to this sort of, and it's perfectly legal what he did. Perfectly legal. And that's something to keep in mind. God. I said I was gonna give you 20 minutes for discussion and everything. You just never get that, right? So, final chapter. As I said last week, the cost of greenhouse gas emission reduction really depends on future relative prices, and this is terribly important. What we're looking at here are two scenarios, one with a conventional technological development and one where, for some reason, the price of renewables fall faster. And what you see is that by the end of the century, instead of paying $220 per ton of C on emission reduction, for the same emission reduction we would only pay 86, right? So that is a very substantial cost saving. And it's not just future technology that matters, it's also current technology. What you're looking at here is what would happen if China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe would move to US standards of energy efficiency. What you would see is that in China, if they were to do that, instead of emitting 780, they would emit 190. So this is not non-existing technology. This is not future technology that has yet to be invented. No, this is today's commercial standard in the US. Would cut emissions from 800 to 200. But if they were to move to Japanese standards of technology, it would go from 800 to 80, right? So it's not just future technology that matters, but it's also the diffusion of existing technology that matters. And these are enormous savings and enormous numbers, right? So if somehow we can accelerate the rate of technological progress, if somehow we can accelerate the rate of technology diffusion, emissions would fall and the cost of emission reductions would fall as well. But the question then, of course, is, yes, true, hard to disagree with this, but how do we actually do this? This particular point I made last week already. For that, we need to look a little bit, and you must have seen this with micro at some point. We must look at why do innovators innovate, right? And the problem with knowledge is that it can be copied, right? If I think of something and I tell people about it, they know it too. And that immediately implies that the innovator will not reap the full benefits of the innovation and therefore underinvests in R&D. Furthermore, R&D is a risky investment, right? You invent something to sell on a future market. It's not that you think of something and it materializes. No, you have to build it, test it, license it, market it, and that typically takes years or decades. And also, you can invest in R&D, but actually if you hire smart people, you never know what they're going to do. Right? So returns on R&D are actually very uncertain. You don't know what your researchers will produce, because if you think of something new, it's new, right? And you can't predict that. If you could, you would have known it already, and you don't know what the market will be in the future, right? And because it is risky, there's more underinvestment. And then immediately implies that any policy that accelerates R&D, so we have an under-provision of this public good, if we can provide it more, we actually start growing the economy and increasing welfare. It's important to distinguish here between what do we actually mean by innovation, what do we mean with technological progress, and typically it is split into three parts. One is invention, that is a new blueprint, thinking of something that didn't exist before. Then there's innovation, taking the blueprint from the academic paper and turning it into a project that can be sold. And that's the process from the blueprint to the first sale. And the third bit is the fusion, going from your first sale to market saturation. Right? And it's important to distinguish between these things because they're different disciplines, right? This is the genius in the ivory tower. Innovation, that's essentially engineers tinkering. The fusion is about marketing, and it is about optimizing your production process. So this is where the MBAs come in, right? So that is important to distinguish, but also motives are very different. The fusion, if you successfully diffuse your product in the market, you're going to be rich, right? So you don't need to motivate people to do this, right? The profit motive is enough here. Innovation is the promise of future wealth that drives people. So this is people starting a company and taking it to the initial public offering, or IPO, or being bought up by Google, right? That is innovation, so it's a profit motive that is there. Invention, this is Nobel Prizes and that sort of stuff. Essentially what you want to do here is just get smart people, lock them up, throw away the key, don't bother them with students or anything. That is how you invent new things, right? So this is what universities do, and government labs. This is what companies do, right? So the regulation is also very different. Here you just want a strong university and research system. Here you want to have a promise of a future market. So if you're talking about stuff that reduces CO2, what you want here is if those things are only profitable if there is strong climate policy, then what you want is a promise of future climate policy, not current climate policy, future climate policy, right? That is what you want here, whereas here you want to completely to give subsidies and those sort of things. So what can the government do to do all these things? The most important technology instrument is the patent, right? And the patent is the worst policy except for all others. And essentially what the patent does is it gives you a temporary monopoly. So where the knowledge diffuses and everybody can copy it, they're not allowed to. They have to buy a license from you, and essentially you are given temporary monopoly rights. You can also give subsidies. Problem with subsidies is that they typically go for effort rather than success. So there's tax breaks on R&D effort, which means that a lot of activities that are not really R&D are reclassified as R&D. So you get a tax break. And it doesn't matter whether what your research has come up with is any good, as long as they work hard, or at least get paid well, or come in high numbers, you get your tax break, right? So the result doesn't matter, it's only the effort does. It is as if I would give you guys marks on your exam for the number of hours that you've studied rather than how well you answer the questions, right? It's just a bad incentive system. And furthermore, those subsidies are typically given to companies that have convinced politicians that what they're planning to do is smart. And the reason that politicians are politicians is because they're good at politics. We hope that they're good at politics. But they're not good at predicting how markets will work or what will sell in the future. The people who are good at that typically are not in politics, they work in companies doing exactly that, right? And that means that a couple of bozos are essentially saying this will save the world, even though they have no understanding of how the market operates or what consumer demand will be, right? So there's all sorts of issues with R&D subsidies. What you can also do is realize that the government is actually a very big consumer, and the government can preferentially procure certain products. So the government owns tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cars, right? From all its subsidiaries and everything. So if the government says we're only going to drive electric vehicles from now on, you have a demand for electric vehicles. Or if the government says we're only going to use recycled paper as toilet paper from now on, you're talking about a very large amount of toilet rolls, right? The government is a big buyer of stuff for the hospitals and the schools and all the things that the government does, right? So that is a way to steer the market towards particular things. You can also do so conditionally. You can say, we're going to start buying this from you if this meets certain criteria. And if that product is not yet on the market, then essentially you're creating demand for R&D, and you take away the riskiness of the investment in developing that product by a guaranteed purchase. And one of the, I think, more brilliant plans that did not go through of Tony Blair and Bill Gates was to say we're going to put $100 million into an escrow account in Switzerland, and the first company that offers us a malaria vaccine that sells for $1 per dose, we're going to buy 100 million doses from that company. And that malaria vaccine at the time did not exist. It was unclear whether it could ever work. But the fact that there's $100 million sitting in a bank account waiting for you to develop that product, of course, means that the uncertainty about will there be demand for my project is taken away, right? You can also give conditional patents or conditional monopolies, where you say, well, instead of regulating fuel efficiency, I'm going to say 2 years after the first car that drives 100 miles per gallon is on the market for 25,000 or less, only those cars can be sold. A conditional monopoly. And essentially what you're saying is, if you develop this thing, Renault, or if you develop this thing, BMW, and you're the first, you will have a monopoly, because the Mercedeses and the Volkswagens can no longer be sold. Which of course gets people moving, right? And if it is an impossible thing that you promise, then no damage is done, right? So what the government has now announced, or as far as government announcements count for anything with its government of liars, is that after 2030 only electric vehicles can be sold. on the UK market. Which is not a conditional monopoly, it's just an announcement of something. And if that turns out to be too soon, then for the whole sector, it will be abandoned, right? So, does this motivate people? Yeah, it sort of gets them going and thinks, well, maybe it gets them going with lobbying and that sort of stuff to perhaps soften this target. Whereas if you just write into law, guarantee this is what will happen if, and if this doesn't happen, it won't, then it's much stronger than saying this is what we're going to do. Perhaps we're going to reverse position. We're not going to get to bankrupt law. Prizes have been were very popular in the Victorian age, where they said the first to come up with this particular invention is going to win 100 guineas. The Atari X prizes are now in the same. So the first company that sent up a rocket in space, let it come back, and within 2 weeks send the same rocket up again, won $100 million. Those things are very successful in the sense that they actually cost little money. If you look at this particular prize that I just mentioned for spaceflight, which is bad for climate, by the way. So they gave out, it was not 100, they gave out $10 million in prize money, and they got companies to invest $1 billion in R&D. And the prize for them was not the prize money, but all the publicity and everything that came with it. And similar prizes are now being used for technological breakthroughs that save energy and reduce CO2 emissions. But the most important thing is if you're developing something to reduce emissions, and that something is only profitable if there is climate policy, then what you need is a promise, a firm promise of future climate policy. Right? Now, if you're improving energy efficiency, there will always be a market, as I argued last week. But if you're doing such a thing as carbon capture and storage, that has no use apart from the subsidy factory. That completely depends on climate policy. What you need there is the promise of future climate policy. And there's this saying in English, there's only two things certain in life, and that's death and taxes, right? If there is a carbon tax, then still bloody stamp duty on house sale, right? So stamp duties were invented in the Middle Ages because it was the only way a government could think of how to levy a tax. And now, 900 years later, they're still with us, even though everybody says that bloody stupid and they distort the market and it's terribly inefficient. Abolishing taxes is very, very difficult. So once you have a carbon tax, chances are it will stay with you. And of course, taxes are relatively predictable in the price signal, much more than the variability that we see in tradable permits, right? On which price are you? What will the future price be of CO2 permits? Taxes are in that sense much more predictable. Subsidies, of course, here are the worst, right? And we saw that in the wake of the the Eurozone crisis, particularly in Southern Europe, where in the years 2006 and 2007 and 2008, the Spanish and the Portuguese government and the Italian government were very generous with subsidies for renewable energy. And there were lots of companies that were doing these things. And then the financial crisis hit, the subsidies evaporated, and all those companies went bankrupt. Essentially overnight, right? So subsidies are worse even than tradable permits because they are so Carried.